There we go. All right. So last week we spoke about we started by talking about the purpose of Yaakov gathering his sons together, and we determined that there was one purpose that had been suggested by our Mefarshim, and that was the idea of going through each son and looking for potential leadership amongst Yaakov's children. And in that light, we reviewed the brachot, or the messages. We said they're not really brachot per se, but we reviewed the messages. There's source sheets here if anyone wants. Reviewed the messages given to Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, and we kind of understood that Yaakov is, in his survey of his sons to see who's going to be a leader, he's rejecting Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, although we did, with the help of Rav Hirsch, see some good qualities, right? They're really achim, they have a strong sense of brotherhood. Reuven, he calls the greatest treasure in his treasury, greatest gem in his treasury. We said these three are really not destined for leadership. And then we just touched briefly upon Yehuda, and we know the fact that Yehuda gets chosen for leadership. And then Rav Hirsch, we ended with this idea that if we hit upon Yehuda already, strike four, if we hit upon Yehuda as the future leader of this nation, why does Yaakov keep going through his children? And we came up with the idea that he still wants to sort of see the unique quality that each one is going to lend to the nation as a whole, as he perceives them down the line, years into the future. So we're going to skip over Yehuda for now. We'll probably circle back to Yehuda next week. And we're also going to skip over Yosef, because those two ultimately receive the blessings of leadership. And we can't really do Yosef and Yehuda justice in such a short time. So either we'll do them justice next week, or we won't attempt to do them justice at all, and we'll do something a little different next week in our same topic. Haven't decided yet. But that leaves us 7 brothers to talk about tonight, 7 sons. And they're like my students asked me what I was speaking about, and I told them, they're like, oh, you're doing the random ones tonight. So we're doing the random ones tonight. Okay. Sorry, guys. Sorry to them. And let's see what we come up with as we explore the brothers and the messages they receive. So we're definitely going to keep in mind Abarbanel's idea that Yaakov's sort of still going through and surveying the potential leadership qualities. He's found Yehuda, and he's later going to find Yosef. But in between, he's not rejecting the qualities, even those that are leadership oriented, that the other sons have to offer. So we're gonna look at those 7 brothers, and we're gonna save ourselves a little time because we're gonna do Yisachar and Zevulun as a pair. And we're also gonna, spoiler alert, do a few other ones as pairs also. But Yisachar and Zevulun are kind of like the obvious pair, and we'll see we'll see that idea in our Mefarshim sort of come through, that they belong together. But I put their 2 brachot here in source number 1. Zevulun lechof yamim mishkon, v'hu lechof aniyot, v'yarkato al tzidon. So Zevulun is going to live by the sea, and he will, it says here, he will be lechof aniyot, will be a haven for ships, and will rest on Sidon. Sidon was Phoenicia, and that was like the major trade port in the Middle East. So if you're living by the seashore, you're probably doing trade with the Phoenicians at their port. Sor, Tyre, that's mentioned a ton in Navi, was the port capital of Sidon. So that's Zevulun. Yisachar chamor garem. Yisachar is a strong-boned donkey. Rovetz bein hamishpatayim. He's crouching among the sheep. Vayar menucha ki tov ve'et haaretz ki na'ema. He sees how good security and respite, tranquility is, and how pleasant the land. Vayet shichmo lispol vayhi lamas oved. And then he bent his shoulder to the burden and became a servant of the king. Okay, it says here a toiling serf. He paid taxes to the king. Okay, so we have a dynamic duo. Last week we had Shimon and Levi, and they were also a dynamic duo in a bad way and maybe a good way, right? Their strong sense of brotherhood, but their inability to channel that sense of brotherhood into a positive outlet. So this week we have another dynamic duo, and their relationship is truly positive, right? There's nothing, we're not going to see any negativity in the Yisachar Zevulun relationship. So let's take a look at the interplay between Yisachar and Zevulun. So Sforno starts us off. It's not Sforno, it's a medrash. That's misquoted. I really apologize. I think I replaced the Sforno at the last minute without replacing the heading, so I apologize. It's a medrash Tanchuma. So Zevulun lechof yamim. Kadam Zevulun liyisachar. So the Medrash has a textual question. Why does Yaakov give Zevulun his bracha before Yisachar? Yisachar was born before Zevulun, and the rest of the brachot, actually Yisachar and Zevulun are also completely out of order here. They're younger than Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. But it seems that Yaakov is grouping the sons together by mother. So if we're dealing with the sons of Leah, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, the next two should be Yisachar and Zevulun, but Yisachar should precede Zevulun. So the Medrash wants to know, why are we mentioning Zevulun before Yisachar, even though Yisachar is older? Velama, and why? Shezevulun osek bepragmatia, v'Yisachar osek batorah. They have this unique relationship. Zevulun is the practical one, he's the earner, and Yisachar is the Torah learner. And there's some symbiosis, there's some relationship between the two that I think is relatively well known, but we'll keep going a little bit. Shekain Moshe Berchan, and even Moshe in his bracha to the tribes of Yisachar and Zevulun at the end of his life, at the end of Sefer Devarim, says, Semach Zevulun b'tzeitecha, Zevulun, rejoice in going out to do your trade, your ships, your merchant work. The Yisachar be'ohalecha, and Yisachar is in his tent, learning Torah, just like his father Yaakov, who was Ishtan Yoshev Ohalim. Yisachar dwells in the tent, meaning he's sitting and learning Torah. We can skip the rest here of the Medrash, and we'll continue sort of to explore this theme for Yisachar and Zevulun. Yaakov blesses Zevulun first, says the Medrash, because it was Zevulun's earnings that supported Yisachar's learning of Torah. So Zevulun's going to get like the credit. Zevulun's going to get the credit for Yisachar's Torah learning, because without Zevulun's material support, Yisachar would not have been able to dedicate his time to sitting and learning Torah. And lest you think that Zevulun didn't gain back from Yisachar, it wasn't a one-way relationship. Rashi in source 3 points out, Yisachar chamor garen, that Yisachar is compared to a beast of burden, to a donkey which carries a burden. And Rashi says, chamor ba'al atzamot sovel ol Torah kechamor chazak shematinino to masui kaved. Like you can place a very heavy burden on a donkey, Yisachar carried the very heavy burden of Torah learning. So not that Torah learning is a burden, but that somebody has to be responsible in this nation made up of 12 parts, that there's going to be all different things we mentioned last week. Everyone's going to bring their unique character and quality to the table. And someone has to take on that responsibility of Talmud Torah. There should be someone learning Torah all the time, right? While other tribes are doing their thing, Yisachar took one for the team and took on the burden of learning Torah, which benefits Zevulun, because somebody's got to earn the money and somebody's got to learn the Torah. And Rashi doesn't want us to think that this is a one-way relationship. It's hard for us in our day to appreciate that, maybe, but Rashi wants to make sure we know this was definitely a mutual relationship. And their contributions, well, actually, here we can look into this Sforno. This one's actually the Sforno source 4. He says, "Kishasayeya ha'echad et chavero lahamtzio de machzoro kedei she'yasok b'Torah k'mosho amru b'Zevulun." When one helps his friend by supporting him financially so he can study Torah, like with Zevulun who supported Yisachar, hinei avodat ha'kel yitbarach b'hishtadluta usek b'Torah tihiyeh miyucheset l'shneihem. The benefit to Zevulun is he gets the reward and the merit for Yisachar's Torah that's learned, and Yisachar benefits financially and materially from the money that Zevulun earned. So mutual relationship. And their contributions didn't only serve each other, but they served all of Am Yisrael. So look at the next Sforno in source number 5. I think this is such an interesting point. Speaking of Zevulun in particular, Chutz me'artzo holech, he's going to travel beyond the boundaries of his own land, lachof aniyot b'minei schora, and he's going to carry all sorts of wares on his ships. And the examples that the Sforno brings, I underlined it both in Hebrew and English, like the chilazon, which was the snail or the sea creature that produced the special blue ink for the techelet, and fragrances needed for the daily incense offerings, among other things. And we see silicone, which make glass. Okay, but Zevulun, amongst the things that he's going to import to Israel, are things that we need for national religious practice. We need the specific fragrances for the ketoret, and we need the specific snail, the chilazon, for the purpose of the techelet. And so we're relying on Zevulun to import those things from outside the land. So we need Zevulun. It's not just Yisachar who needs him to earn money for his Torah learning, but the entire Jewish nation needs Zevulun for the contributions he's going to make to ritual Jewish practice. And Yisachar's only contribution also isn't just his Torah learning, and Rav Hirsch addresses that in source number 6. So he says that chamor is used figuratively to designate a trait of character, which is quite on a level with all other noble qualities, is clear from a pasuk in Yeshayahu. So we might interpret chamor as a put down, because if you call someone a chamor, it's a put down, right? But Rav Hirsch says a chamor was actually referenced in Yeshayahu as a very noble animal, a very noble creature. Accordingly, chamor garem, a flexible, supple power which takes heavy burdens. Such strength will Yisachar develop, a strength which works and bears. Okay, so it's not a bad thing to be a worker, to be just like a hard worker, says Rav Hirsch. In Yisachar, that disposition is described, which works gladly, but only in such a way and with such an idea as has worth in the true Jewish nation. He's not working for his own means and his own ends. That's Zvulun's job. He's working, and he's going to end up being a farmer. Yisachar, the tribe of Yisachar, is going to work the land, but they're going to work the land only in as much as it serves the nation. What does that mean? While in Yehuda, the ruling tribe, and in Zevulun, the commercial tribe is presented. So Yehuda is the kingship, and Zevulun is commerce. In Yisachar, the real backbone of the Jewish nation appears, the Jewish land worker. He does not work to go on and earn more and more wealth, that Jewish man of the people. He does not wear himself out in the pressure of his work. He works to earn leisure for himself. He works so that he can have not free time to have fun, but free time to learn. For that, he bends his shoulder to take on burdens. He leaves the ruler's scepter to Yehuda, the prize of commerce to Zevulun. He's not interested in great wealth, and he's not interested in great power. He's not tempted by military glory, nor by the wealth to be made in trade. He knows other conquests and other treasures, i.e. Torah, that can only be won and only nurtured in leisure. He's really a man of the earth. Question? Yeah, it's a great question. I know I read that Rav Hirsch and I was like, wait, 1 second, he works to support himself. I think it's like the really bare minimum making ends meet, and then anything else is provided by Zevulun. So Zevulun's not, paying his mortgage. Yisachar is making sure there's food on the table for his family, but anything else beyond that is coming from Zevulun, according to Rav Hirsch. Yeah, and there's other sources that discuss that Yisachar doesn't just learn, but also work the land. But again, doesn't sell his produce in the market. That food goes directly on his table. Yeah, it's a really good question. So it's very interesting. Yisachar and Zevulun, they have this like symbiotic relationship where one earns and one learns, and they mutually help each other by giving materially in one direction and spiritually in the other direction. And they also do things that benefit Am Yisrael. Remember, Rav Hirsch pointed out last week that every tribe is going to contribute in some way to the establishment of Am Yisrael. And so not only does there have to be someone learning, and does there have to be someone supporting those learners, but there has to be commerce, there has to be trade. There are things we need to import, and we know that when the Beit HaMikdash gets built, so many things were sent from Sidon down to Israel. So we need those ships that belong to Zevulun, and we need that quality that Yisachar brings to the table, not seeking power, not seeking wealth, but working like a humble, just man of the earth, working the land to provide for his family, and then using the rest of his time to do that Torah learning, which is fascinating. And Abarbanel, who was the guy who told us this is all about leadership, says, these are wonderful qualities. He says, V'yadua shehamelech v'hamoshel ein ra'ui shehiyeh socher. But they're not qualities that contribute or that really lend themselves to national leadership. A king is not really a merchant. Ki cherpa lo. It's a terrible thing for the Arbanel to say. It's like too blue collar. Like you're the merchant, you're the farmer. Those are not like jobs that lend themselves well to national political leadership. V'chein amar Moshe Rabbeinu alav hashalom b'virchotav samach Zevulun b'tzeitecha v'yisachar be'ohalecha ki lihiyot Zevulun rochev hayam be'aniyot amar alav samach Zevulun b'tzeitecha. Zevulun's happy with his lot. He doesn't want to be the king. He doesn't aspire to leadership. And that's okay, right? That's okay, says the Abarbanel. Not everyone is going to be, we mentioned this last week, not everyone's going to be the leader, and not everyone wants to be the leader. He's fulfilled by his role as the merchant, the master of commerce. Right? And same with Yisachar. He loves his life where he works the land just enough to make sure that there's food on the table and has the rest of his time devoted to learning Torah, he doesn't want to give that up to sit in a palace somewhere and be a leader. So they're not rejected for leadership, says the Abarbanel. They're passed over for leadership, and it's win-win. Everybody's happy. Yisachar and Zevulun don't want to be the leader. They want to do exactly what they're doing, which really is a bracha in and of itself, right? To be able to say, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing, and I'm not looking for great wealth or great power or great authority is really a bracha in and of itself. And that comes sort of via Moshe's bracha to them. Samach Zevulun, right? You're happy with what you do. And Yisachar be'ohalecha, you're happy in your tents. You're satisfied with your lot. Not complacency, but a sense of satisfaction with where the station that they've achieved in life, which I think is a beautiful idea. So Yisachar and Zevulun concludes our section of Leah's sons. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi did not get the best blessings, although we tried to salvage it a little bit.
So we don't, I mean, I don't really talk about Yisachar as much in Birchot, but there, like, if we don't, until Yaakov gives us this bracha, like mentioned these things, there's no way to know any of these qualities or see them. Like, yeah, we don't know a lot of these qualities or see them. And then, of course, as Tanakh plays out, and then we see the areas where the tribes settle, clearly Zevulun is, on the shore, we see that some of these qualities either emerge or they presumably emerge, especially when Moshe echoes those brachot, a couple hundred years later, where it's like, okay, I guess this is the nature. Yaakov laid it out, and then Moshe sort of supports it a couple hundred years later by saying the same exact thing. Yeah, but you're right. We don't really get to know Yisachar and Zevulun. And when I teach my high school class and I teach my students about leadership and who's going to be the leader at the end, I'm sorry, I'm putting Hannah on the spot because she was in my class last year, but she remembers everything. But we reject Yisachar and Zevulun purely on the basis of not knowing enough about them to qualify them as candidates. I always talk about it as running a race and who's at the starting line and who's at the finish line. And already at the beginning of the race, we can knock out most of the brothers simply because we just don't know enough about them to say, you really have leadership qualities. You don't have even any qualities that we know of. So we're relying on Yaakov's bracha to be like, interesting, I never knew that about them. Yeah, it's a very good point. So Reuven, Shimon, and Levi don't get the best. Yisachar, Zevulun, and Yehuda, actually, even though Yisachar and Zevulun aren't going to be leaders, the fourth, fifth, and sixth sons of Leah actually get qualities, brachot, that represent qualities that are really going to be fundamental to the establishment of the Jewish people. You've got the kingship with Yehuda, so political success, economic success, which of course is fundamental to any entity, to any nation in the bracha to Zevulun, and spiritual success, the pillar of Torah, in the bracha to Yisachar. So Leah's second three sons, second half of Leah's sons, really get fundamental brachot from Yaakov, that they're not all going to be the fancy, snazzy leadership position, but they are fundamental pillars of future Jewish life, which I think is a beautiful idea. Leah totally deserves it. I think it's great. Yes?
But in the end, because they put Zevulun before, it's still, so it was going on the assumption because he was giving the money and he was supporting it. So is that looked upon as, I would say, better, but
than the Torah learning?
Yeah.
You know what? It's funny. I think the Midrash is careful to say not better, but we have to give Zevulun the credit because Yisachar wouldn't have existed without Zevulun. Right, a little bit Imen Kamach Torah, but not because then therefore if you had to choose, yeah, you're right. If there was no Zevulun, Yisachar would have had to go out and be a merchant himself, and that Torah learning wouldn't have happened. So I'm not sure if the message is better, although I hear your point. By putting him first, he gets to that position of prominence. I think it's almost like Hakara Satov to Zevulun, like, you know what, we got to mention you because the next two tribes exist because of you, or their role exists because of you. I think it's definitely, it's a good question. Okay, so Leah's sons, we've accomplished Leah. So let's now turn to the next set of sons, which are the Bnei Shvachot. They come next, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, and then Yosef and Binyamin at the end. And we said we're skipping Yosef for tonight. So we'll do the 4 Bnei Shvachot, and then we'll do Zevulun, Binyamin, just did Zevulun, and then we'll see where that takes us. So let's look at Dan's bracha in source number 8. Dan Yadin Amo Ka'achad Shiftei Yisrael. Dan will judge his people like one of the tribes of Israel. It's a weird pasuk, and we'll talk about that in a second. Ihi Dan Nachash Alei Derech, Shfifon Alei Orach. Dan is like a snake by the road. a snake by the path. Hanoshech ikvei sus, who bites the heels of horses. Veipol rochvo achor, so that the rider is thrown backwards. Okay. Sometimes you read these, some of them are obviously like bad, and some of them are obviously good, and some of them are puzzling. And I think we just hit a puzzling one. What are we saying about Dan? Okay, so Dan's bracha actually begins with leadership. Remember, we said we're looking for leaders. Dan yadin amo. Dan's going to judge his people. That is a position of leadership. To be the shofet for 360 plus years was the position of leadership. So what exactly are we saying about Dan? What is the leadership role that is being referenced? Then we have a few possibilities, right? What's the leadership role that's being referenced? And are we saying something good about Dan? Because again, springboarding off chamor typically having a negative connotation, and we just salvaged it. Oh, it's actually something positive. Nachash has a bad connotation also. We've never met a good nachash in the Torah yet, right? All snakes in the Torah are snakes. You know, they're called snake for a reason. So we're not really like sure what's going on with Dan, and we're going to try to figure it out. So Rav Hirsch is going to help us out. Rav Hirsch is really bothered by that first pasuk of Dan's blessing, right? Dan yadin, I just put it away. Dan yadin amo ka'achad shiftei Yisrael. Dan will judge his people like one of the tribes. What do you mean like one of the tribes? He is one of the tribes. What kind of statement is that? Like if I turn to my child and I say, I love you just like one of my own children. What does that mean? Like what? That's like a big revelation, you know. If you are one of my children, then I wouldn't tell you I love you like one of my children. That's a strange phrasing. And Rav Hirsch picks up on that. And he says, this whole first pasuk is actually just an introduction to Dan's bracha. It's not part of the bracha itself. And why does Dan's bracha need an introduction? I love this idea. He says Dan was the first son of the Shvachot. He's the oldest of the Bnei Shvachot, whom one of the ex-handmaids bore to Yaakov. The words with which Yaakov refers to him are quite understandable. Yaakov accordingly says, Dan will represent his people as much as any of the other tribes of Israel. Yeah, he is in no way secondary, is as much essentially one of the whole as the others. He is to be entirely equal to all the others, and on his part has equally to contribute his special contribution to the national whole. So Rav Hirsch is saying, Yaakov proceeds by saying, listen guys, the next four, they're like full-fledged sons. There was a lot of fighting, a lot of controversy, a lot of social positioning and status issues, and oh, you're just one of the Bnei Shvachot, and you know, perhaps that might be why they were disqualified in the eyes of their brothers for leadership, like, oh, you're secondary. And they were viewed by their brothers as inferior. That comes very clear from the psukim earlier in the story where we see the brothers interacting with Yosef and with one another. They're like somehow second in status. And Rav Hirsch points out that Yaakov starts his bracha by saying, Ka'achad shiftei Yisrael, full status. They're just like one of my children, meaning they're one of my children. Dan, and by extension, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, right? So I love that because I think that the brothers did need to hear that. Whereas Yehuda, Zvulun, and Yisachar form the main features of the nation, we just said, politics, commerce, Torah, which are essential and permanent. Those are like the three fundamental pillars. The sons of the handmaids bring features which are not just essential and continuous fundamental needs of the community, but are nevertheless useful and helpful. We may not find the pillars of the Jewish nation that we found with some of the Bnei Leah, but everything that these Bnei Shvachot are going to contribute, we're going to deem, I think it's almost a put down that Rav Hirsch says useful and helpful. We're not going to be able to live without them either.
It's almost like trying to legitimize them.
Yeah. Like, don't think you can move on without these four. These four, like, you can't make this mini breakaway nation with just the Bnei Leah, which, you know, if you know the Bnei Leah, that they were probably plotting a little bit, you know, like we tried to get rid of Yosef, didn't work. How can we get rid of everyone? You know, they're like a crew, they're a squad, and they want to be this, like, you know, crew. They don't really want to let anyone in. And that's clear from, like, they've grown also, and, you know, hopefully they've reviewed their former actions, but we see that crew-like nature that they bring to the table. And it wouldn't be shocking if the sons of Leah broke away and tried to have their own, I don't know why I just almost said minion, because I said breakaway, their own nation, okay? Breakaway minion, it's like a phrase that goes together, okay. Okay, so Dan and the other Bnei Shvachot, they have equal role, equal rights. They're not to be viewed as inferior in any way. And Ibn Ezra actually explains that that's actually not just an introduction to Dan, but it's actually part of his bracha, his leadership position. Dan Yadinamo, source 10, Remez Shihiyeh Baal Degel. Remember that when the Jews camped and moved, there were big flags, a standard that one of the tribes carried for each of the sides of the encampment. So every tribe had their flag, 4 sides, and then each of the sides, which was made up of 3 tribes, had like a larger flag that represented their side. Okay, so every tribe has a degel. This is not our topic, this is Sefer Bamidbar, but every tribe had a tribal flag, and then every side of the square had a side flag, and then the Mishkan in the middle was like the Jewish flag, right? Levi in the middle with the Mishkan was like the Jewish flag. So of the everyone together. So says Ibn Ezra, Dan Yadinamo, it turns out if we look at Bamidbar, Dan was one of those standard bearers for his side, right? So it is a leadership position that of the 3 tribes that march together on one side, Dan is the one selected to hold the flag, the standard of their side, right? So Dan, Ke'echad b'nei hagvirot, just like the sons of Rachel and Leah. V'hinei haya kiktzin al kol am b'nei hashvachot. And it turns out that that represents the fact that Dan is the leader of the 4 tribes that are b'nei shvachot. So even though we're not making a distinction, says Rav Hirsch, a little bit we are making a distinction, because within the greater whole, where the tribes that come from the shvachot, Bilhah and Zilpah, have equal rights and equal role and are expected to contribute equally, if a distinction is to be made that, oh, you're from these mothers and you're from these mothers, Dan is going to be the representative of those 4 tribes, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. So there is a leadership role, says Ibn Ezra, with Dan Yadinamo. He's going to be the leader of his Am, right? The people who Dan represents, the other tribes of the Bnei Shvachot. Radak adds another element to that leadership position, source 11. Radak says, Amar ki midan yihiyeh shofet. Dan actually is going to be the source of one of our most famous shoftim. Kemo me'echad shivtei Yisrael, just like a shofet that could have come from any of the other tribes. V'hutzrach lomar zeh mipnei shehaya ben hashifcha. And I guess you might question whether the Bnei Shvachot could produce a shofet of equal measure, equal renown to the other shoftim. Afal pi kein yeh ke'echad shivtei Yisrael b'gedula. V'chein haya rosh degel. We said that already. He's equal. He's even a flag carrier. V'shafat et Yisrael ve'amar zeh al Shimshon. Shimshon will emerge from the tribe of Dan and will be arguably, I don't want to say the greatest shofet, because how could you pick, but one of the greatest shoftim, right? Shimshon will be one of the greatest shoftim. He will really do, the job of the shoftim was really to keep the enemies at bay. The Plishtim were the most vicious and most consistent of our enemies. And Shimshon, ultimately, his downfall was at the hands of the Plishtim, but he did a lot of good stuff before his downfall to keep the Plishtim at bay. He was one of our greatest shoftim. It's mentioned here in the English that he judged the people for 20 years. That's a pretty long tenure for a shofet. So maybe this leadership position, says Radak, is not just like a generic idea of leadership coming from Dan, but Dan Yadinamo, there will be an actual shofet from the tribe of Dan, and that is, of course, Shimshon. Now remember though, shoftim were not monarchs. So we don't want to lose sight of Yehuda, even though we skipped him. A shofet's a great thing, but the shoftim end up being a failed experiment, and the people come to Shmuel and they beg him for a king. They don't want shoftim anymore, right? They're like done with the whole shofet thing, and Shmuel was a shofet, so hurtful when they come to Shmuel and say, could we try something new? We're not so into your style anymore. We're going to go with a melech. We really want one. But so, of course, in the hierarchy, Yehuda as the melech is going to be the ruling tribe, but Dan as a shofet is going to have his heyday, right? As, through the lens of Shimshon. It's a very interesting idea. Abarbanel actually, is that what we're up to? Yeah, Abarbanel actually explains this comparison of Dan as a shofet and Yehuda as a melech through the perspective, through the prism of the animals they're each compared to, which is so fascinating. Abarbanel says, Gam be'inyan hagvura ein safek. When it comes to strength, to might, ein safek, there's no doubt, she'yihiyeh dan kenachash alei derech shfifon alei orach, that Dan is a snake. Lo ke'aryeh, he's not a lion like Yehuda. Ki lo ya'aseh gvurotav berov am hadras melech ki Yehuda. He doesn't take the lead like the king. Aval Dan ya'aseh gvurotav ki ish ragli. Dan has a different role when it comes to power and might. Vilastei mizuyan she'erov et oivo baderech. His role is to ambush. Remember the snake that bites the horse from the heel? The snake is going to ambush from behind. The lion's going to confront in the front. The lion's going to jump out and roar at you from the front. And meantime, the snake is slithering its way around the back and biting you at the heels. Fine. Kilo yatzor Dan koach kamo Yehuda lilchom im oivav panim bepanim. Last line. Dan doesn't have the same valor, the same strength as Yehuda to confront his enemy face to face. Ela baderech ramaut kenoshech igvesus leachorav. He doesn't have the guts, the power, the position, the brazenness to really confront his enemies head on. But he does have something else. And Rav Hirsch says it the best in source 13, so I didn't want to steal his thunder. When Israel is attacked by military strength, Dan will defend it, but not by Judah's like lion strength, but by strategy. Oh, but you need both. You can't have strength without strategy, and you can't really have strategy without strength. They're both so necessary. And I love the way Rav Hirsch put it. Dan's skill is like a snake, his clever strategic nature. He's not a warrior. He's not going to win by might, but he's going to win by smarts. And that's what we say about Shimshon. Yeah, that snaky quality of this was very clever. It's the riddle and the trick and the, right? So 100% fits with what we know about Dan. And Kliyakar then just sort of nails it home for us and explains that both of these styles are necessary for Bnei Israel's military success. And he says something fascinating. He says, Moshe himshil et Dan legur aryeh v'Yaakov himshilo lenachash. That actually Moshe is going to later on compare Dan to a lion's cub, and Yaakov compares him to a nachash, to a snake. But let's even say that it's Yehuda who's the lion cub and it's Dan who's the snake. Remez shekol dayan yeshlo milchama panim va'achor. Everyone in a position of leadership, forget fighting an enemy. Anyone in a position of leadership has enemies in front of them and enemies behind them. Detractors in their face and detractors behind their back. Yesh me'izim b'panav lomar lo mosifani alecha dayanim. Some of the detractors will stand in the leader's face and say, we need a new leader, like we want something else. You know, we're upset with your leadership style. And others will speak about the leader behind their back, but not to his face. Therefore, a leader needs to be a Baal Koach ve'amitz ruach, needs to be tough and thick-skinned. Lilchom panim ve'achor. A leader has to be able to confront those who confront his face, and also manage those whom he knows are speaking about him behind his back. That's a unique quality that a leader needs to have. And Kliyakar believes that Dan has that quality, that he is ultimately, as Moshe praises him for being a lion's cub, able to confront in front of him those who detract, but also able to confront those behind him. And if we zoom out, right, he says, it's beautiful. He's able to ignore and to move on despite the complaints in his face and the complaints behind his back. You have to be both an aryeh and a nachash to be a leader. And I love that, because let's leave Dan out now. We said all these tribes are necessary for the future of Am Yisrael. So Yehuda can be that aryeh and he can confront those that detract in his face, but you still need the Dan who can confront what's going on behind the back. I thought that was like just such a beautiful piece. Okay, so Dan is a snake, but that makes him not less of a leader, but in many ways more of a leader, or an equivalent leader to Yehuda. He's just managing leadership in a more strategic way and in a more, sneaky way, which is the snake-like quality, but no less essential than Yehuda, which I think is super important. Okay, so Dan has leadership qualities, not the leader, but a leader amongst the tribes of Israel. So now let's move on to Gad and Asher. Okay, try to go fast here. Okay, Gad and Asher. So we see Gad and Asher's brachot in source 15. Gad gedud yigudenu, nice tongue twister. V'hu yagud akev. Okay, God will be raided by raiders, but will raid at their heels. And may Asher shmeina lachmo, Asher's bread will be rich. V'hu yitain ma'adanei melech, and he will give royal treats. Okay, again, they both sound good. They both sound okay if we're just going with like reading. And the Ramban explains that the nature will start with God, but then we'll tie them together, that the nature of God is to fight to defend their borders. And the Ramban in source 16 here says, Hanachon sheyihiyeh kemo la'alot la'am yigudenu, yomar ki gedud yigudenu tamid sheyihiyu lo milchamot rabot. God is going to have to fight many battles. Upshat gedud alav be'artso, upashat gedud alav be'artso. And enemy troops, will spread out throughout his land. People will come to attack God's land. V'hu yagudoto al akevo. And he'll follow the enemy's heels, she'itgaber alav, v'yirdofotam. That he will ultimately pursue the enemy and he will overtake them. V'hem yashuvu al akev boshtam, shabach otam bigvura v'nitzuach kol haba'im alehem l'milchama. Okay, so Yaakov is praising God for his ability to defend against those who attack him. And then later on in the Ramban, we can just look at it in the English after the italics, since God inherited a very wide and large land across the Jordan, right along with Reuven and half of Manasseh, bands from Ammon and Moab, his evil neighbors, would always descend upon him, claiming the land and invading it. Yet God lurked like a lioness over its prey, fearing not their noise, nor showing any dismay at their shouting. God's never going to go out and attack. He's not Yehuda. He's not carrying the sword and shield off into battle, but he's going to get attacked an awful lot because his land is valuable and it's exposed. It's a flank. And God is always going to successfully be able to defend his borders and turn around and raid at their heels, like the bracha that Yaakov gives him says. He'll be raided by raiders, but he will raid at their heels. He's going to turn it around and he will end up being the pursuer instead of the pursued. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like we're getting like this almost mini echo of the royalty and the heel, which is interesting in and of itself because Yaakov's name is Yaakov and the heel was such an important part of Yaakov's story, origin story, right? It's a very good point. Rav Hirsch expands on the idea of God defending his borders. He says, God rests quietly at his frontiers, source 17, does not disturb neighbors, but if attacked, hits back lustily and pursues his raiders over the boundary, a cave. Okay, in other words, God's not looking for trouble. But when trouble comes his way, he takes care of it. Okay, yeah, that was very well said. He proves thereby his fresh, bold courage, which when attacked shows that he knows what to do. This is actually the very opposite of Don, because Don is a little sneaky in the strategy. God's not sneaky. I'm not going to mess with you, but if you mess with me, I will fight in your face. Right? Rav Hirsch says it's not the same as Don because there's a little more honesty to God's approach. He's like not looking for trouble, but if trouble finds him, he's going to take care of it. And it's the Tosfot, the Baliyat Tosfot in source 18, who see a relationship between God and Asher, actually much like in a weird way, the Issachar Zevulun relationship. He says, V'im tomar kevan sheyiyu lo chayalot, if God's constantly busy defending his borders, b'mei yafar naseim, how's he going to put food on the table? Like he's worried about God because he's so busy, literally constantly defending against attack. How is God going to support their families? How are they going to eat? Sheharei tzarich osher gadol, to support a military force like that, you also need tremendous wealth. Al kain ketiv acharav, therefore say the Tosfos, the immediate blessing that follows is me asher shmeina lachmo, that Asher's portion is rich, his bread is fatty, is rich. Sheyehei ashir yoter me asher v'yuchal lahaspik mazon l'chol chelotav. So actually, Dat Zakanim points out that there's a debate whether God is going to be richer than Asher. Is that what the bracha is saying? Because Asher's bracha starts out with Me Asher Shmeina Lachmo, even greater than Asher. Will God's bread be fat? Or is it Asher's bread that's going in portion that's going to be rich, that's going to support God and his military exploits? But fascinating, our sources love to pair these guys up. Yeah.
Are these brothers?
No.
Right.
Yes. God and Asher are brothers. Yeah. Dan, Naphtali are Bilhah, God and Asher are
Didn't
Zilpah.
yeah. We just did Don.
Yes.
Naphtali was younger than God. And
Yes.
Asher.
Which is weird because the Yehuda's, Leah's children were kept together. Yeah. And Rachel's children are kept together, but they go chronologically together. So either Yisachar and Zebulun are out of order or Naphtali is out of order. Yeah. But it's meaning we either should have gone chronologically or we should have gone by mother. We're kind of doing a little bit of both. Yes. Very good question.
we separately did this is interesting to me because it's a different aspect of leadership, like just like not savvy
Yeah,
person who's like who understands sort of the organizational behavior behind leadership, right? Like you gotta watch the people that are back talking,
yeah,
back channeling to make sure you maintain the peace and the
yeah,
prosperity.
yes,
This is without knowing that you're going to be under siege. Like if you think about the world today, there's so much innovation in such a rapid pace that you can't just run a business ho hum. You have to constantly be like capitalizing
Yeah.
yourself and innovating.
yes,
And so God will constantly be doing that,
yeah,
which will
fascinating.
benefit the nation.
Yeah,
Because
yes,
that innovation is needed.
is needed for everyone. Yeah, no, I love that point. I don't know why what you said just made me think of, this is the strangest example, but I'm not a great bowling, not great. But it always frustrated me to go bowling with like my dad. He's not like a good bowler, he's just like strong. So he would just like throw the ball down the lane and like he would get a strike just out of strength, but he had no strategy other than his strength. And if you're not that strong, you need to develop a strategy to make up for, what you might lack in brute force. And so I love the way you put the Don and Yehuda piece as well as saying like, it is as essential, especially they're complementary, especially if you don't have the brute force, you are going to need that strategy and strength. And then, yeah, the God piece is beautiful. Yeah, exactly. He is known for his brute strength. Yeah, which is not what we're saying about Don, but it's fascinating. Yeah, although Moshe does bless Don in his blessing later in Dvarim with both the lion and the snake. So maybe that's sort of where that comes from. Rashi says something fascinating about Asher, what's fat about Asher's portion in sources number 19, and then we'll look at Chizkuni in 20. He says, what made Asher's portion fat? Ma'achal haba mechelko shel Asher yehi shamin, sheyihiyu zeitim merubim bechelko. His portion was full of olive trees. Behu moshech shemen kema'ayan. Olive oil flowed like water in Asher's portion. It was like olive oil everywhere. It's a good fat, but it's a fat, right? That's what they say. Even Moshe's blessing, he will dip his foot in oil. It's not a bad oily quality. It's like a fatty, rich quality. And look at what Chizkuni said, because I think this is fascinating. We're talking about every tribe needing to contribute. Chizkuni says, "Mas shel shemen hayu govim mimenu malchei Yisrael limshoach bo." That was the oil that was mixed into the shemen hamishcha to anoint the kings of Yehuda. So we needed Asher's portion because we needed his olives to make that shemen hamishcha, just like Zevulun brought the chilazon to make the techelet and the ketoret spices to make the ketoret. Like there's a very practical element to Asher which contributes to the nation. Now it is interesting. Oh, and also used to soften their skin. Okay, thank you for that. We're all going home and doing an olive oil mask or something like that. But it's interesting because actually many kings of Yehuda were not actually anointed, because a successive king doesn't get anointed. And David, of course, was a dynasty. Shaul got anointed. David got anointed 3 times. So thank you, Asher. And there are weird times in the succession of the Davidic dynasty where there's like a weird interruption, and therefore there needs to be an anointing. There's some takeovers, hostile takeovers. Queen Atalia, who's really from the family of Achav, and then it's like when she's done, it's like let's anoint again just to get us back on track. So Asher's oil is going to come into use, not with every king, but it's going to come into use. But I thought that was fascinating. Okay, so God and Asher, it's again Chizkuni, to be fair, reads the pasuk as saying that God's portion was even better than Asher, so God didn't need Asher. But the Tosfot see Asher as essential for God to be able to defend not just his borders, but the eastern flank of what was then became Israel, right? In order for God to defend the flank of the entire country, the entire boundary, we needed Asher's oil to put food on God's table. So I thought that was like just another nice relationship. And that brings us to Naphtali. So Naphtali is an Ayala Shlucha, source 21, Hanotein Imre Shefer. Naphtali is a gazelle let loose. He utters beautiful words. And there's a famous midrash, in the interest of time, I'll paraphrase, but there's a famous midrash about Naphtali that as Yaakov's sons are burying him, right after this section in our parsha, Yaakov's sons go to bury him back in Ma'arat HaMachpelah, And no sooner do they get there than they're confronted by Esav. And Esav gives them this whole play on words. It's a cave of pears. It's Ma'arat HaMachpelah, and Leah's buried in there. And I was really supposed to be for Leah, so that's my spot, right? And the sons of Yaakov say, well, actually, it's our spot for our father because he has the deed to the land. And Esav says, I don't see a deed. So the brothers are like, oh, shoot, we left the deed in Egypt. That wasn't very forward thinking, but no problem, because Naphtali is an ayala shlucha. He's fast as a gazelle, and he runs back to Egypt, and the actual Naphtali, not the tribe of Naphtali, and he runs back to Egypt, and he comes back, and he waves the deed, and then there's a fight, and Esav's head gets cut off, and it rolls into Ma'arat HaMachpelah, but Yaakov gets his spot. Okay, so it's all thanks to Naphtali and his speed, which is interesting. I love that medrash because, again, we're looking for what does Yaakov mean when he compares, his sons to these animals. And so far we've seen real meaning. Okay, but what is this thing with swiftness? And this is it, Naphtali's big moment. He runs and gets a deed. So Ramban has a different explanation, and I think it does a better job explaining the role Naphtali might play in the evolution and the future of the Jewish people. So the Ramban says, Minhag b'moshlei eretz lishloach ze lazeh ha'ayalim. The way kings communicated with each other was to, like a pigeon, a messenger pigeon, a carrier pigeon. Thank you, I couldn't think of the word. So these were carrier deer. They tied a message around their antlers and they sent them off in the direction of their fellow king. Ramban says it was a minhag. I don't know, never heard it before. But they would run to the neighboring kingdoms and they would deliver the message, and then that king would send a message back, and that's how they communicated, kings to kings. And the message was tied to the horns of the deer. And it was a fast animal, so it was very, good idea to use this animal for messaging. And the deer would then come back, the gazelle would come back and bring word.
Same Torah.
And Basura. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. So it then says the Ramban, V'zeh ta'am imrei shefer, kilomar ayala shlucha mevaser besurot tovot. That there may have been bad news also, but the idea of sending messages was sending besurot tovot, was sending good news, good tidings between kings who were allies with one another. So that's already like a little bit nicer about Naphtali than he once went to retrieve a deed. But the idea of Naphtali being sort of the harbinger of good news, the bearer of good news, is a little bit of a nicer look at Naphtali. And we're not suggesting that Naphtali is actually busy carrying messages back and forth once they become a big tribe, but that Naphtali is associated with good news and good tidings. Okay, again, that one might not be essential for the nation to function, but it's nice. It's like nice icing on the cake for Naphtali. And we'll end really quickly with Binyamin. Binyamin ze'ev yitraf, baboker yochal, ad vela erev yechalek shalal. Binyamin is it says ravenous wolf, a devouring wolf. In the morning, he eats the enemy, and in the evening, he divides up the spoils. It's a parting shot, right? We didn't know how to feel about some of them. Like the snake, a wolf doesn't have the best connotation. And this is like intense. It's like fierce, which is nice. But I'm not sure what to make, or we're not sure what to make of Binyamin's bracha, comparing him to a wolf. So let's see if we can determine whether this is a positive or negative message. And we'll look at Rashi to help us out. So Rashi explains, Ze'ev hu asher yitraf. He's actually prophesizing that Binyamin's descendants will be, the word used in the English here is rapacious, destructive. That Binyamin will be a destroyer. Niba al sheyihiyu atidin lihiyot chatfanin v'chataftem lachem ish ishto b'pilegesh begiva. Where do we see Binyamin being a destroyer? In the story, in the unfortunate story at the end of Sefer Shoftim about the Pilegesh begiva, the concubine who's raped by the people of Binyamin all night, and she's raped to death. Okay, so that's Binyamin being a destroyer. And it played out. The people would refuse to marry with Binyamin, and there was a whole, they ostracized Binyamin, and then they have to make a whole pact with Binyamin, right? The whole story plays out. Veniba al Shaul, but although that's a negative connotation of Binyamin being a destroyer, Shaul is a positive connotation of Binyamin being a destroyer. Shehaya notzeach be'oivav saviv. Shaul managed to quell the enemies on all sides. Shne'emar v'Shaul lachad hamelucha v'yilachem b'Moav v'Gomer uve'Edom v'Gomer ubechol asher yifnei Yarshia. Shaul fought against Moab and against Edom, and whoever he turned against, he made life pretty terrible for them. But that was good for us. So Binyamin has this quality, almost like Shimon and Levi. So we've seen some echoes of some of the earlier tribes in some of the later tribes. Binyamin has this quality which can be good, like Shaul, can be bad, like the Binyaminites in the story of Pilagesh Begiva. And according to Rashi, it's Binyamin who is the Ze'evi Traf. He's the destroying wolf. But Rav Hirsch has another take in his linguistic way, and we'll end with this for tonight. Rav Hirsch says, it would be rather sad if here at his youngest son, with whom he concludes, he could find nothing better to say than to picture him as a that's not a word, ravenous, rapacious wolf. But it does not say Ze'ev Toref, a wolf who destroys, but Ze'evi Traf, a wolf who is destroyed. So that Ze'ev can very well be the object. Oh, it's not Binyamin who's destroying, it's Binyamin who may be the object, the victim of destruction. But if here at the end, Yaakov thinks of a wolf, it is indeed the last glance that he gives over his flock, right? He looks back at his flock, Binyamin's the last one, right? He looks back at his flock and he then sees, which we started with last week, the galut, the future galut, and the power of the galut against which his descendants would have to fight. And he proclaims, it will be the smallest of them, the youngest of them, who will be the one that will drive the wolf from the flock of Jacob. It's ultimately, he says, going to be Binyamin who protects the rear, right? As the last tribe, it's going to be the smallest and the youngest who is going to protect against Binyamin, against Amalek, or against our external predators. And I actually thought that was a fascinating idea because we know that Shaul from the tribe of Binyamin is tasked with vanquishing Amalek. And one of his great failures, one of his two great failures, and it's the greater of the two, is that he doesn't succeed in that task. But then who's going to come along from Binyamin? Who's going to succeed in that task? Mordechai and Esther. They're going to come along from the tribe of Binyamin, smallest tribe, and they are going to put Amalek in the form of Haman in his place, Haman and his 10 sons representing Haman, Amalek's future, and he is going to put Amalek in his place. And so Rav Hirsch says Yaakov's bracha at the end, while it doesn't sound or feel great to Binyamin, he's actually saying, like, Binyamin, you got to be like the wolf that guards my flock. And that's such a beautiful bracha. Remember when Shaul gets the kingship, he says, but I'm Israel, I'm from the smallest tribe, and he forgot about Yaakov's bracha. Yaakov, according to Rav Hirsch, is saying, small you might be, right? And remember the best musar, I think, that Shmuel gives, Im katan ata beinecha, rosh shivtei Yisrael ata, even if you're small in your own eyes, that's not the way other people look at you. Don't look at yourself as small. If you look at yourself as small, you're going nowhere, but Yaakov looked at him as not only big, but essential to the salvation. And if we think to the Mordechai and Esther really, really far into the future, the way the Jewish people are going to survive Galut and survive the hands of Amalek is through the efforts of Binyamin, that smallest tribe. So we'll stop here for tonight. And then next week, I'll surprise you with whatever our plan is going to be. Okay. Any other questions? Those were the great questions.